Good morning, everybody. We're just going to let people come in through the doors and we'll get started shortly. Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for the doors. Well, the doors are open and people are coming in, so we'll just wait a moment or two before we get started. All right, I think it's 10:01, so we'll get started and we'll let people come in as they do. So first of all, I'd like to say hello to everybody out there across Canada and internationally. And my name is Chris Gilford. I'm the president of the Canadian International Council branch here in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And I'd like to welcome our CIC members and our guests speaker, Keith Mines. And we're glad that you could join us here today. Before we do start, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members, we live, work, and learn on unceded Coast Salish territory, and we give our thanks to the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations as we meet on their traditional lands. And for those of you not familiar with the Canadian International Council, we are an independent membership-driven think tank with an express mandate to engage Canadians on international issues. And what makes us quite unique is that we have 18 branches across the country with some 1,400 members. And the branch here in Victoria is quite lively. And I invite you to go onto Facebook if you have a Facebook account and check out CIC Victoria because we're always on the lookout for new members. We have about 420 members here on the island, including 100 students. So please do get in touch. And this morning we are here to discuss Keith's latest book. It does have actually a very long title, other than Why Nation Building Matters. The actual title is While Nation Building Matters, Political Consolidation, Building Security Forces, and Economic Development in Failed and Fragile States. And Keith is going to speak about his book today, and I've also just read his book, and so I have questions for him. And after that, we'll go to an audience Q&A. And for the Q&A, for the audience Q&A, I'm sure all of you are familiar with Zoom. It's at the bottom of the screen. Please ask your questions there and not in the chat. And just so you know, we are recording this event today. Now, as I'm sure all of you have read before this event, Keith has taken part in nation building efforts around the world as a missionary, a special forces officer, a diplomat, an occupation administrator, and a United Nations official. And in his book, he uses cases from his own career to argue that repairing failed states, fragile states, is a high yield investment, and it's important, very important for a stable global future. Now, today, he is the director of the Latin America program at the United States Institute of Peace, which he joined after a career with the State Department. And he was most recently in the State Department, the director for Andean and Venezuelan affairs. And in his 32 years of service, he has worked in governance and institution building in Central America and Colombia and the Middle East and Israel and the West Bank and Haiti, and the list goes on and on, as I'm sure will hear today. And he retired from the State Department in 2019. And more importantly, I think, well, just as important for many of us here in Canada, lots of time in Afghanistan. And of course, I know we've been focused on that ourselves up here. So first of all, Keith, welcome to CIC and CIC Victoria. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. It was a part memoir and a part lessons learned, and it spans many of the countries I've spoken about, including Afghanistan. And I noticed that the book has received very high praise, which is always a good thing. Bing West said it was a classic destined to be studied in American embassies around the world. And James Dobbin also spoke highly of the book. And, you know, you've been so busy. I wanted to ask you what motivated you to write the book. Where did you find the time?
So thanks for the opportunity, first of all, and thanks to all those joining. And I hope we have a good discussion today. You know, it's funny, I was in Afghanistan for a bit, but I was in Canada for even longer. And I actually started the book while I was in Canada. So I was posted to Canada after my time in Iraq, which was during a posting to Budapest, and it was for me a very inspiring time, in part, I think, because Canadians could think more creatively about a lot of the problems that we had been facing in Afghanistan and Iraq than Americans could. And the fact that they thought about it at all was also different than, frankly, where I had just come from in Budapest, where it was just not something that was, it just wasn't part of their reality. So in Canada, of course, it was a daily reality with troops on the ground in Afghanistan. So anyway, the book came out of my frustration coming out of Al-Anbar. I was posted to Al-Anbar, Iraq, as what would now be the senior civilian representative. Back then, it was just called the governance coordinator. And so we had this coalition, of course, run by Ambassador Bremer. And then we had these, again, it was even before PRTs, but we called them just these governance offices around the country in each province. So I was assigned to Al-Anbar, the only pure Sunni province in the country, a third of Iraq geographically, borders with Saudi and with Jordan and Syria. Very complicated province, and of course where the insurgency eventually really took off in Ramadi and Fallujah. But it was a very frustrating time because I just didn't feel like anyone knew what we were doing, we as a team, and I also didn't feel like they had a good sense for where the war was going at that time. So I came out of there in 2004 with the idea that it was time to write it up. So I came to Canada. I had a full-time posting there. It wasn't like I was on sabbatical, but I had some time that I could write in mornings and weekends and holidays and stuff. So I started a book that I thought was going to be just about Iraq and my time there. So that was the genesis of it. I didn't get it done. Went on to a bunch of other postings, and then came back around to it in 2015 and 16, when I'd been back to Afghanistan and a couple of other places. So then at that point, it really didn't make sense to try to just do something on Iraq. It was, the literature was saturated, the field was saturated with other books on Iraq. So I said, let me just try to tie together all of the different places I've been and see if there's some larger lessons learned here. So I started to piece that together. And then I had a one-year fellowship at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I am now. So I went there while I was in the State Department, spent a year, and was able to crank out the bulk of the writing there, and then started the editing process and all the rest over the next couple of years. So from 2016 to 17, I wrote the book, and then it was published in 2020. So the title is a mouthful. I had this very clever title to start. It was going to be Boots on the Ground, Wingtips in the Palace, Why Nation Building Matters. And the publisher said, look, you don't get to do stuff like that. You're not like some known name that's publishing a bestseller or something. You're a functionary, and we got to get every keyword in the title we possibly can to try to help sales. Anyway, so they flipped around the title a bit, and that's where we got everything but the kitchen sink in the title now.
You know, I've written a few articles myself, and probably spent more time on the title than the actual article, only to have the editor's note out. And you mentioned Canada. You were in Afghanistan in 2002. There was the quick pivot to Iraq, as you said, and then of course I read in your book that you came to Canada, and that must have actually been quite the surprise to come from such a fast-paced world of essentially, well, very early nation building, if you like, in Afghanistan. Certainly not the case in Iraq, because events were unfolding very quickly. And then you came here, boom, to Canada. Totally different. But as you said, there were things about the Canadian environment, the Canadian, our country, that kind of inspired you. Can you speak about that?
Well, inspired me, and also, I thought there was some of the best work that's ever been done, frankly, on federalism and the Iraqi problem, if you will. And Ben Rouswell, my good friend, was at the forefront of that. He ran a very good conference, and the book came out of it about the federalist question in Iraq, and it was really good because everyone was trying to figure that out. I don't think that those that were working on it, frankly, from the coalition at that time, and then later from the U.S., I don't think they understood it very well, and I think there was key options that were not really well explored. So I was quite struck by that, and I mentioned that actually in the book, that Ben's work and a couple of others, that really got the federalism experts to look at that. And I thought it was, in Canada, what I experienced was it's just something that you all deal with in a much more immediate way than we do in the United States. We're dealing with it more now because people are using it for all sorts of nefarious purposes. But, in general, the American Federalist Project was kind of in an okay place, whereas in Canada, it was, it was kind of more raw. You were thinking through, how do we manage this relationship between the center and the periphery, if you will, as expressed in kind of developing world terms, but the provinces and the federal government. How do we manage this in a way that allows us to retain our nationhood, but still gives the freedom to the provinces? Again, a classic federalist dilemma, but I just thought there was some really good thinking on it. And again, that book that was done 2004 or 5 was really, really just a classic, I thought, in those questions. And I don't think it was ever really considered at the level it should have been by policymakers. We kind of muddled through, and fortunately Iraq stayed together and they kind of fought their way through it. But I think there were some real issues that could have been proactively worked and managed and done up front that would have precluded a lot of the pain that they later went through. That's kind of what the book is all about, frankly, is the places where, if we did get to an okay outcome, a lot of times it was a lot harder than it needed to be.
What I like about the book itself is you go back to your experiences in El Salvador, in Haiti, in Iraq, and of course in Afghanistan. So it sort of takes you from the sort of 1980s and all the way through up until today. And of course, we've just seen the catastrophe taking place in Afghanistan after a very long period of nation building, and maybe a little bit of hope in Iraq, actually, with the recent elections there. And a colleague of mine, a former Canadian ambassador, now he just wrote an article where he said that Canadians who have spent their lives working on international security issues with their US colleagues, now he said this, I didn't, but he said that they don't often spend enough time figuring out what makes other people tick and rely on US military power to get the job done. And this, when I read that, it made me think of your message in the book that nation building is a long game. The military is just one piece, and we need to pace ourselves. But I think the real issue when we look at Afghanistan is that we kind of did pace ourselves in Afghanistan over, say, 20 years, and arguably, obviously not enough. But I think you said America doesn't lose wars, they lose interests. So how can you pace how does pacing it yourself actually work in situations like this? And I do wonder, after what we've seen in Afghanistan, if in Washington right now they would say, look, this nation building stuff is far too complex. We best keep it at arm's length and not do it any longer. So, what is the future going to be like in Washington now when they look at situations similar to Afghanistan?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions embedded there. Let me start with the first one. But... No, it's good, because it hits really the heart of the book and my thesis. So the issue of politics versus military, that if we have the 3 Ds, political, security, and development, or the economic, as I put it in those terms, political consolidation, economic development, and security forces or security systems. I mean, which again tracks with the 3 Ds. So that's kind of the common way that I think we're used to breaking these things out. But the thing that I think we really got wrong, and it perpetuates today, because if you listen to the quote unquote experts talk about Afghanistan, we always go to a failure of military strategy. So it has always been for Americans, and I think we dragged a lot of others along with this. It's been about winning the war. The fact that it's looked at as the forever war. Well, it was only a war because there was a huge political issue that was unresolved, and that was the place of the Taliban in the Afghan state. And those were decisions that we, the international community, made for very good reasons. I don't question them. In 2002. To exclude them from the First Loya Jirga, and then to go on trying to exclude them from the Afghan state after that. Now, again, that was those are the guys that facilitated the attack on the World Trade Center, attack on America, but it was kind of a global thing, since think most of the world's kind of been in New York or knows New York. It certainly was something that resonated in a way that it might not have in the deserts of Arizona. I mean, it was something that was very raw to the whole world. So, all right, so we're all in this together. We're trying to figure this out. But, we immediately just wanted to solve it through military means. And so it was military means, but not backed up by a coherent political strategy, ever, frankly. So 2002, and so when we say that we stayed with it for 20 years, those 20 years were very inconsistent on every level. And so, we stayed there. I don't know if we stayed with the project, and I'm not sure that we were really clear from the start on what the project was, but I would argue that it was always about consolidating a political arrangement in Afghanistan that worked at the national level. That's the nation part, and then played out effectively in the state institutions throughout the country. We did some of all of that, and I'm not too critical, because I think these are hard decisions and they take a long time. I was in the first Loya Jirga, really stunning experience to me, and I write about that in the book. And I was one of just a handful of Westerners in the tent, but that was an extraordinary example of the international community facilitating an a local process. It wasn't something we came up with. That's how they've always done things. But they were unable to do it because A, they didn't have a building large enough to do it in. Everything had been destroyed. B, they didn't have the means to transport delegates to Kabul. They didn't have the kind of political means to even help select those delegates. So there was all sorts of impediments. So the international community was able to do that. And I'm a little bit sensitive about this notion, well, these countries have their own processes and we can't get involved. I don't agree with that. I mean, there's times when we, the international community, are simply the essential player to helping to get to a good place. You also hear a lot of times, well, they don't want us here. Well, we need to be a little careful about who the they is. There are some theys out there that don't want us there. The country at large that just wants to move forward in a peaceful way, those theys probably do want us there. So I think we just got this a little bit, backwards, that we kept trying to fight our way and muscle our way through what was a political process. And I don't think we, the international community collectively, were able to see that as the goal, that the goal is not winning a war. And again, that's a very American thing. I hate to say it, but I think Patton was right. In a way, Americans just love to fight. Anyway, we just kept trying to muscle through this thing with force. And then even, the divorce between what those forces were doing and how it was going to play out was most obvious, I think, during the surge. So the Taliban starts to regroup, which obviously they would have, since we left a security vacuum for the first 2 or 3 years when we turned our attention to Iraq, and basically did the same thing, knocked off a government without a real strategy for what comes afterwards. That's also something that I would point out is really new. In American history, in interventions, we have never really done that. This was a whole new experiment that had never really been tried, because in the past, in every intervention in American history, we knew that we had to stay around afterwards to consolidate political order. That's just a fundamental task. That's the other end of the war that it has to be done, or the war itself probably wasn't even worth fighting. But we had this grand experiment by Rumsfeld and some of these people that said, let's just knock off regimes and hope for the best. So we did that twice in a row, but then realized several years later that didn't go so well. We do need to do at least something on political order. But again, it was very haphazardly delivered.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you look at the record of coming out of Afghanistan, Iraq in 2003, you can add, I guess, Libya 2011, and
exactly.
even the attempt to get rid of the Assad
Correct.
government has another example of where interventions have gone horribly wrong over the last 20 years. And this sort of comes back to this idea that it's just now, I just don't know if there's any appetite in Washington to reinsert America into other places around the world. We see Venezuela as potential flashpoint, or Haiti, another one. No one seems to want to get involved there at this point. So any appetite left in Washington, do you think?
Well, I mean, this is part of what I also hope the book does, is help to regain some ground on the damaged brand of nation building. Now, the term itself, I debated whether to use it or not, and I debate whether to continue using it today. I guess I'm stuck with it because the book's got it in the title, in that long title. And but now the president himself has spoken out against it twice. It's not every day you write a book and the president kind of invalidates your core premise, not just once, but twice. We don't do nation building. He was very clear about that, very categorical. But the brand, I think, is important, but the name is important too. And I debated this a little bit, or asked the question of my mentor, Jim Dobbins, he did everything I did from the policy perspective, and then with time on the ground as well. But he just said, look, I've written 5 books now on nation building. He said, I'm not going to try to rebrand it because there's nothing else that works. And I had a conversation actually at a breakfast this morning for Bernard Henry Levy and his new book and film that he's in Washington promoting about his witness to genocide and to all the different things that happen in the world. But we had this conversation as well, and somebody was throwing out different possible rebranding, state strengthening or institution building or something like that. And Dobbins is of the opinion none of those work because they don't capture the comprehensiveness that is essential to leave behind a stable, functional state. And I tend to agree with that. So anyway, that's the nation building part. But the answer is right now, no, we have now confirmed through 2 elections that the will of the American people is very insular. We're very skeptical of any of these different projects abroad. Again, I would hope that we can have a bit of an open mind, about the ones that went well, of which there are a number, B, about the ones that may not have gone great, but were adequate, and then C, about the mistakes that we, the international community, and I'm focused, of course, on the United States, made in the process. So some that again probably could have worked had we had a better architecture for it, better doctrine, in some cases, better people, a better relationship with the UN, which I cite over and over again is simply the key organization that has the resources, the manpower, the mandate to do a lot of these things for all of the problems that come with the UN. And I get it, and I lived a lot of them. But at the end of the day, it's the one mobilizing place where you can pour the resources and again also the political work, because the UN actually does that, I would say, much better than a coalition that would come that just isn't designed for that. There's no coalition, there's no instant coalition that is designed to do that kind of political work, whereas the UN comes with a whole field doctrine and presence and capacity and everything else that goes along with it. And frankly, with some very good leaders. I worked under some of the real superstars of peacekeeping, Lansanas Kouyaté and Enrique Terhorst and Lakhdar Brahimi. There was some real, top of the line diplomats doing that political work that came in with a kind of a intuitive sensitivity to what was going on the ground that just made them extremely effective.
So because of what we've seen in Afghanistan, there has been a great deal of self-reflection, especially when it comes to where the money went. And of course, a lot of money went to NGOs and the people on the ground with their SUVs and whatnot. One of the things I liked in your book that I thought was important is when you're speaking about the situation in Darfur and the folks that do criticize the aid industry with the high salaries and so on. And you mentioned that you saw, of course, another side, which I also saw when I was in Afghanistan, committed and idealistic people and who are bringing touches of humanity to what you said was places that are unmoored from civilization and sinking fast. And I think this is a really important point, because people are paid a lot of money to go out on the ground, but these are not the best places in the world. And there are so many people that want to help still. Mm-hmm. And when I look around the world in places like Afghanistan, even today, I have friends here in Victoria who are planning on heading back soon to keep going on the important work that's being done there. I'd like to take you back to 2002, if I could, mm-hmm. back to Afghanistan, where you say in the book that we were starting from scratch, which is so true. At the time, you had high praise for Ashraf Ghani, who was Afghanistan's finance minister. And as you said, when you were speaking about the Loyal Jirga, it was a new day for Afghan women as well. What was it like to be on the ground in 2002?
Yeah, it was quite exhilarating in some ways, but I think also sobering. And I don't know that people realized just how much work lay ahead and how hard everything was going to be. I've had that happen elsewhere too. I spent 4 years in Mexico as the head of the Merida Initiative, which was our first big partnership with Mexico building institutions. And I think it was odd to people to think of a middle income country like Mexico that literally had no functional national police, no investigators, no forensics labs, was really starting from scratch, frankly, on their judicial system. It was a real eye opener. I think people didn't realize that. Anyway, Afghanistan was obviously times 10. It had been through a 20-year civil war, basically the fight with the Soviets, in which Afghans broke down and took sides, and then perpetuated that after the Soviets left. The thing that I think we ought to remember in all this is that the West, if you will, put them up to that civil war because we needed their help to fight the Soviets. That's something that we seem to forget with abandon right now. But that was kind of our bright idea, and that was what armed Afghans and got them ready for the civil war to come. We kind of did the same thing to Somalia, so I think we should take a little bit of accountability for that in terms of what we do afterwards. But I was surprised again. The Loya Jirga, there was not a single building in Afghanistan that could have held 1,700 delegates. So the Germans actually were the ones that brought in an Oktoberfest tent, which I thought was hilarious. So that was the only structure that was going to be big enough to hold them, and it was an incredible gathering. But they were coming in from all over the country, and just hearing their reports from the countryside and the rants and raves and everything else. But I saw starvation. I mean, in 2002, there were still kids that you could see fairly frequently with kwashiorkor. There was famine, there was hunger in the countryside. And so we were starting from a very basic level. And then politically, it was a country that had been politically and socially completely fractured. So all of that was going to take a very long time to get right. It was couldn't be rushed, and we were always impatient. We the West, we the internationals, there was always this just pressing impatient. Let's try to get this done. I think that was, in fact, the reason for the surge. Begrudgingly, we'll give you a surge of troops, but you got to get it over with in 18 months, and then the troops are coming home, and you better have it fixed. Well, there's no way. That was never going to work. There's no way to surge through. Again, you can surge militarily, contain people on the battlefield for a time, but that political process had to play out. And it was just destined to be messy. There was huge things that were left pending. The relationship between the central government and the provinces. There was the question of leadership that had to be worked through. And it was, as it is in all of our systems, a messy process. So some of that we would have just had to stay the course for a very long time. I think it could have gone smoother than it did, but I would argue that when we pulled out, it was still a country that was struggling, but could have remained viable with additional time and support. So these things, we're not talking about years, we're talking about decades. And at the time, frankly, in the initial time, we were talking in terms of months, as we did in Haiti as well. Haiti, the mandates were always in 6-month increments. One of the most important mandates was actually a 4-month increment, because somebody was trying to get it on some kind of political cycle or something. So we said, you get a 4-month mandate. Well, on the one hand, you want to press the country to do as much as you can. So my ambassador in Haiti was Bill Swing, and he was very, very smart about this stuff. And he said, look, our message to Washington has got to be, we need more time. And our message to the Haitians has got to be, you don't have any more time. And he said, we got to manage those two messages. And that's legitimate. But, from the outsiders that are trying to be helpful in a political process that takes, again, I'm sorry, but decades, there's got to be a sense of patience and pacing and keeping the resources at a level that will allow that longevity to play out. That was the other thing, was if people throw around these figures now, $1 trillion here, $2 trillion there, that is almost all for military deployments, which are very expensive, something like $1 billion a month for a battalion or something. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. So that's where most of the cost came in. It actually didn't go to a lot of the, the other stuff that we talk about. Let's bring our dollars home and do nation building at home. Well, not many of the dollars would actually be in that category. And then actually the first thing you said also, I'll just comment on, yeah, I tried as best. I actually had a whole lot of stuff built into the book to talk to profile some of the real heroes, I think, of these operations. However they came out, it wasn't for lack of trying by a lot of very dedicated people, and they weren't starry-eyed idealists. I mean, they were people that knew there was something at stake here that they could influence, and that it mattered. I mean, it just really mattered. It was something that they could see was, what I do here is going to have a material impact on a generation of people in this country. And I just saw, I saw an awful lot of sacrifice. They were casualties just like everybody else. By the time I left Afghanistan, I think there have been 300 contractors killed. Contractors were doing a lot of the work that had normally been done by the military and others. And there was some just tremendous, sacrifice by people. There was one thing I highlight also in the book is in Darfur was these military advisors. They were retired NCOs from across the retired American military apparatus that were brought in to go out to each of the AU bases and just help with the processing of intelligence, the getting the maps right and everything on operations and stuff like that. Very behind the scenes, quiet guys. They did not get rich on this. The figure I remember was something like $70,000 a year. They were not at all getting rich, and they were out in the hinterlands. So a lot of really incredible work. And the ones that do get paid well, again, people aren't going to do that for free. But I would argue that it was all in operations that mattered, again, where they were willing to take those risks.
Yeah, and I think you made a great point earlier on, speaking about the Mujahideen and the Soviet experience. We forget that Afghanistan has been pulled in so many different directions. We, as you know, funded the Mujahideen. The Soviets were there. 15,000 of their young men were killed. They were also involved in nation building, not just the military piece. And they had all of their people, their agricultural advisors and so on. Mm-hmm. They get thrown out. We eventually come in. We do our part, but of course now the Taliban are trying to derail us. And now the irony, of course, is they're coming back to the international community with their cap in hand. So it's a bit of an interesting story, I guess. When you, I just want to read this line because you went to Iraq in 2003, as we know, but you have so many great observations in this book. But one of them I wanted to just read out for the audience. You said, when fighting insurgencies, the civilian population becomes a center of gravity that cannot be avoided. Tribal politics, history, social stressors, religious convictions, employment options, the status of women, educational alternatives, and the exercise of power all combine into a thick stew of cultural geography. And I really just love that last, the cultural geography piece. And this is the piece that we always appear to be missing when we do go into countries. And I think that for me was a key message of your book, that when you're thinking about interventions, the people in the room that are around you, they have to be a different set of people.
Yeah, that was something that it was hard, I think, for a lot of people, a lot of military officers to come to terms with. In Iraq, I got to Ramadi and worked with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And this, again, it's interesting to see the trajectory. So when I got there, the Marines were just leaving Hilla. This was in the summer of 2003, because they really thought they were done. And we thought it was over. They're done. The Marines were going home. So they wrapped up a couple things and off they went. The 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment was given the entire province of Al-Anbar. So this is, one regiment, equivalent of a brigade in non-cavalry terms, and they were given an entire province. And they did really well. They had some really sharp young officers that immediately pivoted from their military duties to civilian understanding. But it was still just one regiment for a third of Iraq, basically. but that was where we were. Well, that obviously started to unravel quickly, and then the 82nd Airborne Division came back as a division to handle El Anbar, and then also part of some other provinces. But it was interesting when I got to Ramadi the first time, or with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and the colonel said, he said, "This is great." He said, "I'm glad to have a POLAD, political advisor." And I said, "Yeah, I got to tell you, sir, I'm actually not your POLAD." I said, "I don't even work for you. So I'm going to be, we're going to coordinate everything, but I have got a whole nother task here. My task is to try to help develop a political process and support a national political process that has helped the whole country to cohere." But his idea was military was the center of gravity. The political people are there to support the military in their security mission. And there's obviously times when that is exactly how it should work, and it must work. Like there's times in counterterrorism operations when all you care about is getting the bad guys, and so you're doing political things to whatever, get basing and have arrangements, and so they are in support of a very deliberate and direct security objective. So there's times for that, and I guess during the fighting of World War II, the politics were basically keeping the coalition together to continue to fight the Nazis and the Japanese until it was over. But once it was over, then the whole thing pivots, and the center of gravity is now the political piece of consolidating order in these places so that we don't have to stay around doing it forever. And that was something I think we were very confused about. But the 82nd came in after that, and General Swanwick, he got it intuitively. He got it immediately. He never imagined that I would work for him. He said, Mines has got his own political operation out here, and he got that. His objective was to be in support of that, and we worked very closely together. And so, when I would do things on the political side, I made sure that there wasn't going to be a disconnect with what he was doing with the forces. Anyway, that's something I think we've gotten wrong, and it's just a lot more complicated. I think a lot of people would just rather fight their way through something because it's, we get to call the shots. We'll tell you when we're going to attack something, and then we pull back here, and that's frankly a lot easier. But it's not just not the center of gravity. The rest of it is super complicated. And I tried to paint the picture of what these societies are going through. They are going through everything at once. They're going through this huge economic transformation, a religious transformation, a political transformation, cultural. They got everything thrown at them at once. They have very high birth rates. And so there's the press of people, but there was things embedded in there that you could see clearly were just really going to be a social cultural issue that would quickly become a security issue. And I think jobs was the one that was so obvious to all of us on the ground, that if we do not transition this economy in a way that gives people jobs, we're in real trouble. The guy that's done the best work on that is Canadian, Roland Paris. Mm-hmm. And his book, At War's End, phenomenal. He did, he not only had bright ideas and observations, but he did the research, and he showed that, in a transitioning country where there's these kinds of threats and this kind of just raw process going on, that don't go in with some crazy neoliberal project that's going to upend what is a quasi-functioning economy defined at least by people going to work every day and receiving a salary. And we debated that ad nauseum in Iraq. Those of us that wanted jobs over neoliberalism lost. And that was a catastrophic mistake. That was right up there with, firing the entire army and debathification. I would say those were the three biggest things. Again, things that were just not focused on the political reality. They were focused either on our own notion of how things ought to be, or, trying to do it on the cheap, because if we get them to a proper neoliberal framework, maybe we won't have to pay so much for this. It was really missing the point.
I do see we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to try to segue into those because I want to take you, first of all, back to Afghanistan again in 2012. You spent 13 and a half months on the ground at the time. And again, some observations that you made. For example, we're not dealing with small cuts or bruises clinic, but with the emergency room. And I thought, of course, that was key. But one thing that really that made me quite sad actually to read was something you said in July of 2013. And I quote, you said, "The Afghans are slowly gaining confidence, but always with a backward glance to see if we are still with them." And of course, here we are in 2021, and we know the story. And you point to the fact that there was a post-warlord generation growing, a post-conflict generation that we seem to have lost. And so tied into that is a question I have here from Robert Springboard, and he says, could you please assess the effectiveness of Zalmay Khalilzad?
Well, I worked with Zal from a distance. I didn't know him personally, but he was in as our special envoy the first time I was there in 2002, and he was not in the picture the second time. But then I'm familiar with his work. I mean, he was very effective, I think, that first round, certainly, in trying to piece everything together. There was a lot of stuff going on. We had to figure out the role of the king in the political structure and the society. There was questions of religion, and would it be an Islamic republic, which in the end it was, which was fine. But that first go around was really a lot of stitching things together. And then of course he came back several other times. I think he was an effective ambassador. The last time I think he was given impossible instructions, and I think he did the best he could to fulfill those. But his instructions were basically get the United States troop presence down to zero. So I frankly, I don't know why he took that job, because I think he had to know at that point that was not probably the right thing to do. But I think that's as far as I go with Zal.
Yeah. Do you think, though, we've looking at events now, we have lost this new generation of Afghans?
Well, that's a good question. I write in most chapters about youth, because as a diplomat, you naturally reach out to youth, and we would do, everywhere I went, we would do visits to universities. I mean, one of the most interesting ones, I'm not sure I wrote about it or not, but I went to the university in Al-Fashir, Darfur, which everyone had this idea that everyone's just walking around as living skeletons. Well, Al-Fashir is, there's two major refugee camps there, so tens of thousands of refugees. There was a very dynamic university there, and I went to their opening. They had a jazz band and procession, and kids from my compound, which was kind of in the desert, the kids would be up sitting next to a tree studying every day because they didn't have a place at home to study. And it was really kind of inspiring. But I would say that, youth are really, and I think we all do this, we all pay attention to them. Nobody's missing this, but I think we don't often tie it together. But there is a youth wave in the world right now that wants a different world. What I tried to write about in the Afghan chapter, though, was that how they were going to be stuck until the previous generation passes on. And where it was most obvious to me was with Dostum, because I saw the Uzbek youth, that he just has a lock on the Uzbeks. And that's how he got to be vice president, of course, was he delivered that block to Ghani, and that was what they needed to win. And, it's so they have to get beyond that, and they don't have a way to do it. They're not going to fight their way through it. They're not going to be insurgents or something. So I think there's just a patient waiting. But, they're more educated, they're more switched on, they have a different vision. And I do think we should not ignore them. And I think we should not write them off, because I think there's a wave of youth that are simply different than often the miserable conditions they're living in. And I think they're waiting for their opportunity. And I think that's really high yield stuff, is to stay engaged with them.
It ties into what you just said. You mentioned General Dostum, and it ties into a question I have from Roy Cullen here about the all-important subject of corruption that we see in many of the fragile and failed states around the world. And he mentions Sarah Chase in her new book, Thieves of State. He asks, what is the winning way to build institutions in failed states? The media, the judiciary, how can we actually go about this? Because it just seems to be so hard.
Yeah, Roy, it's good to hear from you. That's an excellent question, and it's something I actually deal with probably more directly now that I work on Venezuela and now Central America. We're starting programming in Central America. I mean, the first thing I think is for all of us to recognize that there's a very direct, again, political issue here, that it's not just about corruption as a place where resources are lost and companies have a harder time. There's real political weight to the issue, and Central America is probably the best place to see that playing out, where people, because of corruption, don't have the means and the livelihoods and the security that they that they need. So that's a pretty obvious one. Venezuela's kind of off the charts in corruption, so I'm not sure that's even, it's kind of a unique case, but it is one where, again, it will be a test case for restoring those institutions one day and then trying to build back in the things that are necessary to combat corruption. So there's a whole lot of different tools, and we're trying to inventory these actually for Central America now and think it through. And we'll be relying on, some of this work of Sarah and Roy and others that have done this all over the place. I mean, there's a couple of places where things kind of seem to be a good idea. The couple of the CIC in Guatemala, Honduras had something similar. These international mandated bodies that were there to kind of help with and oversee anti-corruption efforts. In the end, the country kicked them out because it was obviously getting at the interests of somebody. And this is the real challenge, is getting to a place where, you've got the means to institutionalize the good intentions against corruption. It's super hard. It's often, again, dealing with, longstanding, not only weak institutions, but societal reasons for having weak institutions. And I think that was a little bit what we found in Mexico. Was there was some places in where you could see that it was actually in the interest of somebody to have weak institutions so they could do what they wanted. And so, you're fighting with some real entrenched interests. But I think it's something that we've got to get a handle on. I mean, you look at Latin America, my current region. I mean, you've got the past 3 Peruvian presidents are even either in jail or going to jail or have committed suicide based on corruption charges. And the across the entire hemisphere, it is a persistent issue. And it's just, again, a hard one. Now, there's another program I'd mention from Roy Godson, another Roy, from Georgetown, Culture of Lawfulness. And I thought that was a very creative program that he came up with to try to empower and link the media with schools, with law enforcement and judicial institutions, and the business sector. The business sector is the one that often gets left out, and try to build a new culture, a culture of lawfulness. Now, somebody once said the hardest period in establishing the rule of law is the first 500 years. So, again, these are long-term projects, hopefully not 500 years, but there again, there's societal shifts and informational shifts, and then also the institutions, of course, that go along with them. So a lot of pieces there, but I think we've got to keep trying, because it is, again, it's something that is leading to migration challenges. It will make things harder in terms of pandemics. And frankly, in some places, it opens up such a window to violence. Mexico, of course, the classic case right now, 30,000 deaths a year from narco trafficking and criminal violence, warlike levels of violence, and opens up whole areas of the country to anything. So yeah, something I think we just have to keep trying at.
I've got a couple of questions here from retired military officers. First of all, from Admiral John Anderson, who is a former Canadian Chief of Defense Staff, and Brigadier General Don McNamara, both very close friends of mine. First of all, Admiral Anderson, he points out, I think, well, when you were speaking about the United Nations and having the UN involved heavily in nation building, and I agree with everything you said. Sometimes it's difficult. There has been talk of bringing a coalition of like-minded liberal democracies together to take on big problems. Perhaps you can speak about that. And Don McNamara talks about a very unique organization we had in that sort of 2005 period in Afghanistan, made up mostly of military officers and some civilians. They were the Canadian Strategic Advisory Team put together by General Hillier, and they went in to help Afghan ministries. I guess afterwards we saw a lot of that, a lot of help going into the Afghan ministries. I don't know where that help will come from now, but if we go full circle here, a coalition of liberal democracies, is it possible? And on Don's point about the our previous experiences there, I just wonder where the Taliban will now turn to for help.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, on the question of the architecture for this stuff, it's a great question. I don't Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of us working on conflict resolution. We have a lot of bright ideas at USIP. We publish a lot and we do events, but obviously we're just an institute, maybe one step up from a think tank because we do have the U.S. in our name. But it's obviously that's not where conflicts are going to be resolved. It's got to be something in the international architecture. I don't see anything other than the UN. Obviously, the UN is going to be harder with the Russians now. The window where we could do things together is over, so they're trying to needle us. So, like on Venezuela, I've written with other, actually with some notable Canadians. I did an op-ed 2 years ago where we were advocating for a stronger UN role in Venezuela, not an intervention, but a UN political role where there was openings. And I think there is still an opening where there's things that could be done, but the Russians were going to be very difficult on that because their whole strategic objective in Venezuela is just to needle the United States and in our backyard and make it difficult for us. So it's always going to be harder. But I think there's always going to be at least some places in the world where we can get through the system and still get something on the ground. I think in Haiti, there's no stomach for it, but I don't think that it's necessarily opposition by China and Russia. I think it's something that could be done. So I would still look at the UN, and I think in terms of developing a multinational strategic approach, I think the UN is still the place where it ought to be happening because it comes again with the resources and the mandate, and it just makes it work. Obviously, the thinking has got to go on elsewhere. Places like USIP and the host of Canadian institutes that work on this. I think the thinking's got to come from elsewhere, but it's got to be, I think, kind of internationalized and institutionalized in the UN. I was intrigued, and I remain intrigued, and I think it's a great idea. This idea of a community of democracies, and there's a couple of efforts at that. I think the challenge is going to be everybody just being so gun shy right now, starting with the United States and not wanting to risk anything. I think it's just going to be hard to come up with anything that backs any of this up. I asked Bernard Henry Levy this morning a question in this session about risk, and I said nobody wants to take risks, and he was very adamant. I was actually quite kind of impressed by how he answered it. But he said, "Look, these things will always come with risk. And we have to be ready for that, and learn to minimize the risk on the ground. But they're never going to be risk-free." But he made the point that not doing anything is also not risk-free, and I agree. And that's also, I think, where this whole question of state fragility. We have a whole act of Congress now on trying to improve the functionality of states and close some of the gaps of state fragility that lead to terrorism, pandemics, genocide, and all the rest. So I think that we need to be realistic about that. The other question about the SAT, I was very impressed by the work of and I thought it was a genius concept. I remember when Canada sent those teams in. But now let me just back up. The reason they had to do that at all was because the civilians just didn't come forward. The first time I was there, I was assigned as kind of liaison to 3 ministries. I had Ashraf Ghani in the finance ministry. I had the transport ministry, commerce, and it was just amazing to watch these new ministries standing up with absolutely no idea how to run a ministry. And I remember one of my ministers was going on an international trip, and so I said, "Well, let's get your bio done in English." And so I looked at his bio, and it was, graduated from primary or from secondary school in 1977, joined the Mujahideen in 1978, fought for 20 years, and now he's a minister. I said, okay, you kind of lost a lot of the normal developmental, stuff that people would go through on the way to running a ministry in a normal country. But that was the reality. So they were anxious for help. They would have taken help from anywhere. Nobody provided it. Ghani got some help in finance because it was so important, and he was ironically the one that least needed it because he actually knew how to do that sort of thing. Maybe not run a whole country, but he was pretty good as a minister. So I think it was genius. The thing that I also try to do in the book is promote civil affairs from the United States and your equivalent in Canada. They were tremendous because they're reservists that come in with these skills that nobody on active duty has. I mean, if you join right out of college, join the military and spend 15 or 20 years, you've been doing military stuff. Well, these guys have been out as police chiefs and medical practitioners or whatever. So they came into Iraq and they were phenomenal. The guys that I had in Iraq, the guys and gals that we had in Iraq were phenomenal. They could do business conferences. They could advise a ministry on how to do a budget. And it was really something. And that was something that I think was tremendous. So that was kind of done as a, hey, the civilians didn't show up. Hillier recognized this is super important. We can't just let it go. Because again, this has everything to do with how successful we're going to be together on this project of building this new nation. So God bless them, we threw into it. But then we the civilians kind of showed up later in large numbers, and again, it was a little bit inconsistently delivered, but I think in general well-intentioned. Although I would also say, even as late as 12 and 13, when we were in the midst of the civilian surge, there was nothing at the provincial levels. There was no mentors, handful of programs from Aga Khan and other places in some districts, but that whole piece of building state apparatus in the countryside, that was largely missing, never really got underway.
I can remember filling out visa applications for senior Afghans coming to Canada and always having to ask, okay, now what happened between this period and this period?
Yeah.
Because of exactly what you say.
Yeah.
I know our time is short, and at the close of your book, you speak about, you offer 10 principles to help, let's say, get things right in the future. And it ties into what Don Scott has said in the Q&A area about sometimes us siding with the wrong people in these states. But you offer this doctrine, getting that political compact right and building security forces and economic reforms. Basically, do all of this and you should be okay. And what I thought was most important was, don't be afraid of the gray zone, because this is messy business at the end of the day.
Yeah, that was the thing that I think, and I guess this is what frustrates me, is I was on a talk show the other day, and I said something about Iraq as a good enough, as kind of good enough. Now, again, it was a lot harder than it needed to be, and when I say that, I don't say that flippantly, because a lot of people died that probably maybe unnecessarily on both sides. But I also believe that Iraq, in any circumstances, was going to take a long time. They had a lot to work through. And a lot of that was only going to happen through a period of violent readjustment of the political order, which is a euphemism for civil war. So that was always going to be hard. There was no question about that. But I do believe that, we need to recognize when things are kind of good enough. And that Iraq is one of those where it's going to play out in a very gray area. And I use the example of the initial battles in the north, where Dostum would call his Taliban counterparts and make fun of them, and that's something we just can't really come to terms with in the West. We are us and they are them, and we have enemies. And the notion that these guys had worked together and been together and switch sides, and then they come back around and surrender and change their mind and revolt in a prison. I mean, it was this long process of a very big gray area. And that's what just played out again, that I think people were shocked by. But the Afghans looked at it and said, okay, we're not going to win without air support. Air support's leaving. There's no point in fighting. We're not the Alamo. We're not, Westerners that are going to fight to the death on the beaches of wherever. We're Afghans. We know that this stuff is super complicated, and sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down. And that was, unfortunately, I don't think people factored that in, but that was the way they would have done things. That's the gray area. We're in a gray area there again now. It's not, and we got to figure out how to help them get through this. And, we can lose interest, but that doesn't mean 35 Afghans go away. So hopefully we don't lose interest and get something figured out on the humanitarian side. And frankly, keep working on the political side. It's a process. Taliban's up now, but it ain't forever. So, hopefully working through it in some way that we get eventually to that, that multicultural, moderate place where everybody's got a chance.
Yeah, it's certainly a strange set of circumstances to be in. And I see, Keith, our hour is up. I knew it would go quickly. And I think we could do a whole separate discussion just on Afghanistan, maybe in a few months when we see what's happening more and more on the ground. But I would like to thank you for today. I know you're really busy. We never got to talk about Venezuela. because I know you're off to Venezuela very, very soon. So unfortunately, we didn't have time to talk about that, but maybe when you come back. And I would say to the audience today, buy this book. I do have 3 copies. If you're interested in this area, which I'm sure you are, this is a wonderful book. I don't say that about all the books, but this one indeed. And we do have 3 copies, which we will be getting around to 3 of our lucky CIC Victoria members later this week. And so I'd like to thank you all out there for participating today. And we do have a few upcoming events with Jeremy Kinsman on Europe, and Chris O'Connor, who was the UK ambassador to Tunisia during the Arab Spring. So we'll be focusing on that. And so with that, Keith, I'll just turn the mic back to you if you'd like to say a few words before we leave the audience today.
Well, thanks. No, it's really been a pleasure. That was a lot of fun, and happy to come back whenever. I'm off to Venezuela tonight, God willing, and see how that goes. And we continue to look for a way to move forward there again in another very gray, opaque area. So I threw the discount code for the book into the chat. There's a 40% author's discount that you can get through the University of Nebraska, not through Amazon, although with the postage, I think they're actually probably pretty close now. But anyway, a bit of a discount there. Anyway, yeah, happy to continue the discussion on anything that makes sense, but I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yeah, we would love to have you back. And I already have some ideas, so stand by for another email at some point. Early next year, I think would be wonderful. Thank you so much, Keith. Have a great rest of the day and safe travels to Venezuela.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And goodbye to the audience.